I got really bored and decided that I'd read the second chapter to you guys today and just push the third chapter till tomorrow. And hopefully by then I figure out how to get videos from this thing to there so that we can have a change of scenery so you're not in the storage-ish room. The storage-ish room. I could put something behind me. That would be great. There's nothing I can find. So, on to chapter 2. I went to school the day after the funeral. Renee said I didn't have to go, but I didn't know what else to do. I wasn't allowed to go home. I had a few things from there brought over in boxes, but that was it. The house was still a crime scene. Ron wouldn't let me go out there at all. But you're the sheriff, I said to him in the hospital as he and I sat waiting for Renee to sign the paperwork and check me out. He sighed. I know, he said, but you can't go out there. Not now. Not yet. When? I asked. He shook his head. No answer at all. So my choices were to sit in Renee's house, spending the day with a grandmother I didn't know, or go to school. I knew the people there better than I knew her, and I kept thinking about what she'd said at the funeral. How there'd been so much anger in what she'd whispered to my father. School was easier to deal with. It shouldn't have been. There should have been stares and whispers, and maybe there were, and I didn't notice them. I was just glad to be out of Renee's house, out of the reminder that her blue guest room was my room now. That my house, my parents, my world was gone. I sat through my first 3 classes, just like always, in the back watching everyone else. My father's hadn't liked schools in Woodlake. He'd been through them and thought they taught crap. He'd been so sure he hadn't learned enough that the summer before he started college in Chicago, he took the bus there and spent all his time reading everything he could in the public library. I had so much to learn, he always said, and I don't want that for you. So I spent 15 years learning at the kitchen table with Mom and not going to Lakewood schools. Mom was a good teacher. The ones at high school were okay, but they didn't come up with anything like Mom did. In English, we were reading Julius Caesar, but I already read some of Shakespeare's plays when I was 13, and then watched movies of them and read about how the themes were so universal they could be filmed over and over again. I knew the play, and so I was ready to talk about it, but this discussion wasn't anything like the one Mom and I would have. All the teacher talked to us about was Brutus and what he did, why he did it. No one wondered about Julius, about his drive, his will, why he made the choices he made. Mom had me think about it. She would have asked me about it. She liked hearing about school, and had been the one to talk Dad into letting me go in the first place. He only agreed because Mom's business, she made and sold wild fruit preserves. And some singer swore in a magazine article that a diet of them and rice crackers kept her thin and had taken off, and we'd needed the money she was able to make. The paper Dad worked for, the Woodlake Daily, kept cutting staff, kept cutting salaries, and really only survived because the owner was old and believed everyone should start the day reading the paper even if she had to basically give it away. I'd been excited about going to high school when I started last year. I loved my parents, but I wanted to make friends, meet guys. I'd seen some cute ones around town. I wanted to talk to them. I wanted them to want to talk to me. I wanted to be like the people who lived in town. I didn't want to be like me and my parents were. I didn't want my whole life to be the forest. I didn't want to be like the Santos family who lived in the woods just like we did, but who hardly ever went into town and who always looked vaguely startled when they did, as if the small cluster of buildings that made up Lakewood's main street was enormous, overwhelming. I didn't want to be like their daughter Jane, who I'd only met a handful of times, and who could talk for hours about the forest, but who didn't want to watch TV or even talk about books, who said, "I don't know who that is," whenever I asked her about someone I'd seen in town. But high school wasn't. It wasn't hard, but it wasn't easy either. The guys I'd seen in town, the ones who were so cute, weren't so cute in school. They looked alright, but they didn't talk about anything real. They just laughed at dumb things or talked about what movie or person or TV show sucked most. I knew that was normal. I did. But I had pictured guys who did more than check out my chest when they looked at me. I wanted more than guys who frowned over the lack of my chest and then said stuff like, "So you got taught by your mom, huh? That must have sucked." The girls were even harder. They just ignored me. They'd known each other since I was 5 and learning my ABCs in the kitchen with my mom while they went to Woodlake Elementary. They'd been through birthday parties and slumber parties, boyfriend problems, and shopping trips to the nearest mall 2 hours away. They knew who I was, but I wasn't part of their world. And with graduation not in the distant future, but close, and almost and almost they could taste, they didn't need me. They had each other, and the one girl I did become friends with only talked to me because no one else talked to her. Krista had been popular. That was back in middle school, and long forgotten by everyone but her. She held on to that time tightly, though, pulled it out and unfolded it for me to hear. She told me about the birthday parties girls who looked through her used to beg to attend, how she used to have a different boyfriend every week, when all the guy did was sneer at her now. Krista had been a star, but in 5th grade her mother had died and her dad married his secretary 3 months later. Even I heard about that, and Lakewood being different or doing something different wasn't a good thing. So when I started school, Krista was different too. Wasn't a star at all. In fact, she was so far down the social ladder that she was willing to talk to me. She and I only saw each other at school, though. We didn't have a real friendship, but it was the closest thing to one I'd ever had. Even if I knew she only talked to me because I'd listened to her stories about the way her life used to be. On the day I came to school from Renee's house, and not my own, I knew that our friendship was over as soon as I passed her in the hall before lunch. I knew because I saw her see me, and I watched her turn away. I could understand why she did it. Before, I'd been Avery Hood, the quiet girl who lived in the woods like few other people did. But now I was Avery Hood, the girl whose parents had been murdered, the girls who'd been found with their bodies. Krista had lost her mother, but not like I had. I was the girl who'd been found with her parents' bodies. I was the girl who couldn't remember what had happened, who should have had a story to tell but didn't. I was the girl who'd been covered in blood but who hadn't had a mark on her. So I ate lunch by myself, picking at the chicken nuggets on my cafeteria tray. Mama's always made lunch for me before, and it was strange not to be eating a sandwich on her homemade bread. I hated it, actually, the heavy weight of it, and now I didn't even look like a regular bread. But now I missed it. I missed everything about Mom and Dad. She never even really talked about her parents, I heard Krista say, and looked over to where we used to sit, saw her grinning as girls she used to rule years ago stood, looking at her smiling to show they were being kind, that they were letting her in even if it was only for a little while. I mean, she never talked about them. Like maybe she, you know, Krista said, drawing out the last words to let silence and speculation regain. I pushed my tray away and got up. It was true. I hadn't talked about my parents. I hadn't needed to. I was happy with them. And Krista had her own stories to tell, a never-ending supply of them, all once-upon-a-time stories that ended with her father bringing home someone to replace her mother, and how people had stared and talked and then forgotten her. I wanted to hate her for what she'd said, but I watched her smile at the girls clustered around her, saw how happy she was to be seen again, and I knew it was what she'd always wanted, and I couldn't get upset over that. It just seemed wrong to waste tears over her, to cry over something as small as a story, when what was true and real for me, what had been my life, was gone. Still my eyes stung anyway. I left the cafeteria and somehow kept going, even though the school dragged on and on and on. I trudged to my last class, art, wearily. I'd signed up for it because Krista had, and because Mom and I had always drawn together at home. I wasn't any good, but hadn't mattered to Mom. I'd learned about technique and looked at famous paintings, and we talked about what made them beautiful. Mom said that loving art was just as important as being able to create it. Here, loving art didn't matter, and I walked in to see the same bowl of apples that had been defeating me since. And it was strange to think this way, to have to think before and now, and my parents in that way. But I did, and that bowl of apples had been defeating me since before my parents died. They were shiny, perfect-looking plastic. Fake. Krista was working on the other side of the room away from her usual spot near me. I stood alone and looked at those unchanging apples and the drawing I'd started. I only wanted to make the apples look like they should after they'd been in the bowl for a few days. I made the skin spotted, shown rot creeping in. I thought it would be realistic to show how things were, to show that things die. But that was before. I closed my sketchpad and asked to go to the bathroom. I went to the front office instead and asked them to call Renee. Renee, do you mean your grandmother, Avery? Mrs. Jones, the school secretary, said, and I nodded. She knew that my parents didn't talk to my grandmother. Everyone did, and she clearly had chosen a side. Everyone else had too. Back when my parents stopped talking to her, Renee, they sided with her because they found my parents a little strange, a little off. I swallowed. I wanted to tell her that she didn't know my parents like I did, that she didn't know anything, but I just sat down to wait instead. She wouldn't listen to anything I said anyway. As I settled on to the uncomfortable office sofa, someone rushed in, the door flying open, and I got a glimpse of a guy. Dark hair, an old, soft-looking t-shirt, and jeans and moccasins. No guy at school wore moccasins. Someone new? I leaned forward a bit to get a better look, and then, of course, the guy turned and caught a look at me. And caught me looking at him. His eyes met mine for a second, and I realized he'd never looked at me. Never really looked, anyway. His face made every other guy's paled into nothing. It was all stark angels. Cheekbones, mouth, and a strong, straight nose. He was beautiful. And he had silver eyes. Not blue-gray, not gray, silver. I stared in shock at them, and then he was gone. Back out the door, even as Mrs. Jones said, "Hold on 1 second. I'll get your schedule from your file, so you'll be ready to start your classes." Well, she said, when she returned and saw he'd left, "I guess he'll be back in a second. I'll call your grandmother in the meantime. Holler if he does come back in, all right?" I nodded, but he didn't come back. I would have thought I dreamed him, except Mrs. Jones left his schedule on the counter, and I got up to look at it, curious even, though I had no reason to be. He was new. His name was Ben Dusick. He lived out near where I did, where I had. He lived in a place called Little Falls before, a place I'd never heard of. But now he lived with Louis Duzick, who was listed as his great uncle. Mr. Jones said, "Avery, I thought I told you to have a seat." Frowning, she picked up Ben's schedule before I could read more. He didn't come back. "No," I said, and I remember Dad saying something about Louis and our nearest neighbor having someone family moving in. He and Mom and me were supposed to go out and say hello soon. Mom was going to make banana bread. I had said I wasn't going. I had no interest in meeting any relatives of Louis's. He was as old as Renee, and always acted as if he wanted to be anywhere but talking to you. "Sit down and wait for your grandma," Mrs. Jones said again, and I did. Ben didn't come back. I wondered what he'd heard about my parents. I figured it was everything, and wondered if he wished he lived somewhere else now. Renee came in after a little while and waved at Mrs. Jones, who said, "Any news?" Renee shook her head and looked at me. "Ready to go?" I nodded. I got up. I walked outside, and I got in the car. "That bad?" Renee said as we pulled out away from the school. "I was supposed to draw apples," I said, and Renee nodded like she knew what I meant. It made me think of Dad and how you could say anything to him and he would do the same thing. He was always willing to wait until you could find the words for what you wanted to say. I looked at her for a moment. "Why are you so angry at him?" I finally said. "He could have done anything after college," she said slowly. "But he didn't. He came back here and I hated that." "You're here?" "Yes," she said. "I'm still here." The sorrow in her voice was as real as the anger I'd heard at the funeral, and I looked out the window. I could see the road that led into the forest, that led to our house, to me and Mom and Dad, to before. We didn't turn down it. End of chapter 2. Hope you all like that. I'm going to keep reading, but this video is really long because that was a longer chapter than chapter 1. So tell me what you guys think. Is this Ben character creepy, or is he just... I think he's creepy. So apparently Ron is the sheriff. So there's a deputy who was crying. There's a sheriff. And Renee, who I thought would have been a friend or an aunt, is her grandmother. This author really needs to help because her wording is really weird. Like, there's some places that are missing a word or two. So yeah, I hope you like that, and I'll try to figure out how to get videos from my camera onto the computer so we can go somewhere else to read instead of storage room. Alright, before this video gets too long, bye!